The story of Ethernet goes back some 32 years to May 22nd, 1973, when I wrote a memo at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center describing how Ethernet would work and naming it. It was my good fortune to be the first person in history given the job of networking a building full of personal computers. You have to remember that in 1973 there were no personal computers. So building on experience with the ARPANET, the original internet, and some heavy reading into the Aloha packet network at the University of Hawaii, we set out to build a network of personal computers at Xerox. Dave Boggs and I built the first Ethernet in 1973. Our first two driving applications were a laser printer. We were building what I gather is the world's first laser printer, which needed to be shared among these hundreds of personal computers. And we also had early internet access. We wanted all of our PCs to be able to access the internet at high speed. So we came up with the Ethernet, which ran on a big thick coax that wandered down the middle of every corridor, and then PCs in the individual rooms would then, through a cable, go up and tap into this big coax running down the middle of the corridor. I think we were either lucky or very shrewd that we never referred to the coax as coax. We referred to it as the ether. We talked about sending packets up into the ether and having them propagate everywhere. We called this the ether. We borrowed the word from physics. In the 19th century, physicists believed that there was some medium between the sun and the earth, which they called a luminiferous ether, an omnipresent, completely passive medium for the propagation of electromagnetic waves. Now that we felt that this coax through the ceiling in 1973 was going to go everywhere, and it was going to be completely passive, and it was going to be a medium for the propagation of electromagnetic waves, namely the data packets that we wanted our personal computers to exchange. So that was the first Ethernet, 73, 74. Dave Boggs and I built it. In 1976, our first paper was published in the Communications of the ACM. And then in about 1979, June of 79, I started 3Com Corporation to build Ethernet-compatible products because by then Xerox and a company called Digital Equipment Corporation and Intel Corporation had decided to use Ethernet as a standard for the interconnection of their products. We created IEEE Project 802 to make the Ethernet into a standard. And by December 1982, there became an Ethernet standard that we used to start building products. And then Ethernet started taking off. In September of 82, we shipped the first, 3Com shipped the first Ethernet adapter for IBM personal computers. And by 1984, 3Com went public. It was being so successful selling these Ethernet cards for PCs. Through the 1980s, Ethernet then had to battle the token ring from IBM and other local area networks that competed with it. And by the end of the 80s, Ethernet had won that battle by adapting to market realities and shifting from coax to twisted pair. Ethernet finally won the battle and became the dominant local area network. Of course, the internet had a lot of growing to do, and say starting about 1994, when the World Wide Web came out, then the internet really started growing, and people started buying personal computers, not so much to do spreadsheets, but after about 1994, they started buying personal computers to be on the internet. So over all this time, since 1973, let's see, that would be 32 years, Ethernet has been proliferating, and more importantly, it's been evolving. In fact, Ethernet's evolved so much that today what people mean when they say Ethernet today bears little resemblance to the so-called CSMA CD technology that Dave Boggs and I developed in 1973. So more important than Ethernet's past is its future and where it's going. And I've come up with 5 prepositions to describe the directions in which Ethernet is now going. Those are Ethernet is going up, and it's going through, and it's going over, and it's going down, and it's going across, all those directions. And let me summarize each of those. Ethernet continues to go up. It started in 1973 at 2.94 megabits per second. It then went to 10 megabits per second, and then 100 megabits per second, and a gigabit per second, and now Ethernet, standard Ethernet, runs at 10 gigabits per second, and it's going to go higher. We can expect it to go to 40 or maybe 100 gigabits per second in its next generation. So Ethernet continues to go up, but it's also going through. That is, the wide area networking, WAN infrastructure, is being infused with Ethernet equipment. The old equipment that telephone companies used to use, the TDM SONET infrastructure, is gradually being replaced in the core by Ethernet transport. So Ethernet's going up the LAN and through the WAN, but it's also going over the airwaves. It's becoming wireless, which is a little ironic in that Ethernet was derived from the Aloha packet radio network in 1970, which was wireless. It then went through coax and twisted pair and optical fibers, and now Ethernet has come back to wireless again. So wireless Ethernet, more recently known as IEEE 802.11 or Wi-Fi, and then right behind that WiMAX. So you have Ethernet going wireless, breaking free from wireline access to wireless access. Ethernet is also going down. We've spent the last 30 years networking personal computers, but now Ethernet and its variations and descendants are now going to network subpersonal microcontrollers or embedded microcontrollers, of which there are more than 8 billion shipped every year. Those microcontrollers are today largely unnetworked and therefore less valuable and more expensive. But we are moving toward getting even embedded microcontrollers networked, in microcontrollers in automobiles, in ships, in homes, in industrial control, in homeland security, in many thousands of applications. We see those embedded microcontrollers being networked. And finally, Ethernet is going across what George Gilder called the telechasm. Here we have all this bandwidth being created in the LAN because Ethernet going faster and faster and faster. And here we have all this bandwidth in the WAN, the wide area network, being created through the proliferation of dense wave division multiplexing. But between the LAN and WAN has been this bandwidth chasm, the telechasm. That is, the connection between the LAN and the WAN as made available by carriers has been very slow. So for example, you have you've had dial-up service, and more recently DSL and cable modems, and maybe even T1, but all those are very slow compared to the bandwidths available in the LAN and the WAN. So now we're taking Ethernet across the telechasm in an effort organized by the Metropolitan Ethernet Forum, and we're calling this Carrier Ethernet. It's a version of Ethernet which reconciles the advantages of Ethernet with the requirements of service offerings from carriers, so that carriers can offer a bridge across the telechasm.